Are you also concerned? I mean, it's a difficult one to sort of do anything about, right? Certainly not at a legislative level, but it is very striking how many fewer younger women are identifying as lesbians, right? Because they're either transitioning or they're identifying as non-binary or something. And it was already, I think, a long established thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, that women tended to come out later than men. And now there's even more reticence, it seems, at least to be using the word lesbian because of different vocabulary or whatever. But it just seems as if there's a there's a crisis of identification, I suppose.
Yes, and one of the things that surprised me when I was researching my previous book on feminism was how many young women in the LGBTQ plus type organisations in universities, so largely we're talking about middle class women, almost all upper middle class women, who were the problem, who were bullying and censoring other women who wanted to use the term lesbian. And we could argue till the cows come home about whether or not these women were doing it to please men because they were scared that they'd be punished if they didn't toe the line, or, and certainly these women exist in their droves, they are women who just see themselves as not needing feminism, not needing lesbian liberation politics, not needing to see themselves as part of a sex class of women or a group of lesbians that have a special interest. But they just see themselves as individuals that don't need anyone to fight on their behalf. And so they've adopted this very kind of neoliberal approach to life. And anyone that diverts away from their truth, from what they see as a fact, which is that we're all queer, and the word lesbian denotes transphobia, then they will just impose that. And they won't think critically about any of it. And so many of the women who were causing the problems for young lesbians who didn't want to use the word or who were scared of using the word, they're other women. And then, of course, as you rightly point out, often women come out later in life. Maybe women will be more swayable into a heterosexual life that they really weren't sure about at all, with a man who they really weren't that connected to, with a sexuality that she hadn't had the opportunity to express or to even admit to herself. She finds herself married or in some kind of heterosexual coupling, and then later on her unhappiness will get the better of her and she'll live her life as she wants to live her life. But that brings its own problems. And of course, there's some pretty nasty bullying coming from some lesbians who consider themselves to be gold star lesbians. So they're the authentic lesbians. They've never been heterosexual. They consider themselves to be born that way. I mean, as if any baby should be ascribed a sexuality or a sexual attraction is just crazy. As though women who have had a heterosexual past and then meet a woman and fall in love or just decide that this is their preference are inauthentic. At best can call themselves bisexual, they say. They're not true lesbians. So it's nasty bullying coming from some, I would call them essentialist lesbians, the born that way crew. And then on the other hand, there is some awful bullying coming from the queer crowd.
I can't help but, I mean, just hearing about the ways in which lesbian politics is driven by class differences and political differences, whatever, much like feminism, right? I mean, it recalls exactly the same sort of schisms which are eternal, really, within feminism, and which, because you've been involved in feminist work for such a long time, that you've seen for such a long time. I mean, talk to me more about some of the class clashes in British feminism over the decades, because it seems as if all this queer stuff is just maybe the newest manifestation of some of that.
I think you're right. When I first became involved in feminism, I was just turning 18. I was living in West Yorkshire, where there was a very vibrant women's liberation movement. I mean, the real deal. I mean, these women were uncompromising. There was no liberal kind of, as Andrea Dworkin put it, the fun kind of feminism tolerated. It was that you were in or you were out. And if you were in, then what that meant was that you were concerning yourself with the key issues, the one issue that faces women all over the world, the only issue, I would argue, that all women share, which is the fear and reality of men's violence. And of course, the feminist project was to challenge, to speak out about, and to end male violence. And so that was what bonded us. That was the glue that held us together. But within that, there were some huge differences that for a time we didn't really pay attention to. And the result of that was a horrific emergence of, and which ended up dominating the entire movement, and I think quite frankly ending that phase of the movement, identity politics, where it was your identity that carried more weight in an argument or a disagreement than your opinion. For example, meetings that started with speaking as a Black lesbian mother, speaking as a working class Irish woman. And this went on. And it was so ludicrous that often whole meetings were taken up with the announcement of one's identity and depression, or otherwise it was speaking as a white, privileged, able-bodied. I mean, it just was intolerable. And I think the reason why little was said prior to that explosion of identity politics about differences was that women had come together for the first time in a conscious effort to defeat patriarchy, to say there is something called patriarchy, there's something called the oppression of women. Women are a sex class, we're all sisters, and that's all that matters. Well, of course, that isn't all that matters. You know, some of the other things matter. And I hate it when anti-feminists use what the differences between women to try to divide us, because actually, ultimately, we do share something very concrete. But of course, it matters if you're an uneducated working class woman who is surrounded by those in the movement who have one or even more degrees and who can quote Foucault at you and who've read all of the feminist literature and who speak about theory in meetings where you're just there as a young scrap of a kid from a housing estate with no clue what they're talking about. You know, this mattered. It mattered when there were Black women coming into the movement who were saying, well, we can't do things like that because the communities in which we are embedded, that's impossible. And it was, well, we're all women together. I don't see what you're complaining about. I mean, that's putting it very crudely and paraphrasing, because of course we were, if we think about the rest of the left as it was then and as it is now, feminists actually cared a damn sight more about race and racism and class prejudice than any leftist men or any other leftist groups ever did. But I think class became the issue that was forgotten and still is. So what we've got now, of course, is a dominance of upper middle class spoilt brats, in my view, who have been told that they are the centre of their own universe by their parents, who just ignore the fact that they're wrapped in some kind of gold-laced cotton wool and that they'll never end up in prison. Why should they worry about Karen White, the trans-identified male rapist? You know, they'll never end up needing a domestic violence refuge. Why the hell should they concern themselves with men targeting women in rape crisis shelters? So they see themselves as being the ones. I think the way that I see these people who respond to our concerns about men in women's spaces as those very privileged people in extremely wealthy areas of the country, holding up signs that say, asylum seekers, migrants, we welcome you, we want you here, which is to me virtue signalling in the extreme when they are doing it next door to a run-down housing estate in Dublin, where working class people are the ones that bear the brunt of having a load of extra people dumped on them, and that these people complaining about that are not racists. They are not concerned in the slightest bit that the people that are taking up their spaces in doctors' surgeries or the queue for housing are brown or black skinned. They are concerned that they are being treated just as fodder. And the virtue signallers will always refuse to accept that it affects them in any way. So that's the analogy for me. And I think that we've ignored class in feminism at our peril. Because as you've pointed out, Louise, what we've got now is this absolute lunacy coming from elite institutions, whether it's universities, publishing, and the like, that there's no chance of working class women getting jobs in there and daring to speak out about using pronouns in their email sign-off.
I've always cheekily thought that a proposal that would really get up the nose of the sort of the virtue signallers you describe is if we said, okay, so we've got an issue with housing, asylum seekers, overwhelmingly young men. I know, why don't we put bunk beds in university accommodation? And I know you also don't believe that men and women exist. So how about your undergraduate daughters bunk up, you know? What's the problem?
Right.
What's the problem? Please explain the problem.
I like that. Yeah. I think we should put together a
there we
proposal.
go. Get it on the Labour Party manifesto. Yeah.